The Galactic Council thought it was over. It had just begun. The gavel came down before I could breathe. Not a dramatic slam. Not the kind of sound you expect when 900 million lives are being decided. It was a soft, dry click, the sound of something ending quietly, like a candle going out in an empty room. The kind of sound that makes it worse. I was sitting in the upper gallery of the Grand Conclave Chamber on Station Veilthon, the diplomatic seat of the Galactic Council, 63 light-years from Earth. The chamber was enormous, built to hold representatives from 47 member species, each section shaped to suit a different biology. Curved perches for the Threnali, deep pressure pools for the Aqueous Velhari, wide, low platforms for the multi-limbed Chell, and one small, flat row of simple seats near the back, where the human delegation sat, where I sat. 14 seats for humanity. We used to fill them all. That day there were 4 of us. The head of the council's directorate, a Voakai named Supreme Delegate Karathsal, stood at the central podium. The Voakai are tall, gray-skinned, with flat eyes that reflect light like still water. Karathsal had those eyes. They never blinked, not once during the entire reading of the decree. He read it slowly. Every word was translated in real time through the chamber's audio system, soft voices whispering in 47 languages at once. In English, the voice was calm and clear. By unanimous decision of the Galactic Council Directorate, the species designation of Homo sapiens, commonly referred to as humans, is hereby reclassified from sovereign member to terminated status. I heard the words, I understood them, I sat very still. Terminated status. That was the Council's legal term for it. It meant humanity had lost the war. It meant we had lost the right to govern ourselves. It meant Earth, Mars, the 14 colony stations, and every human being alive were now subject to redistribution under galactic law. The decree continued. The Voakai hegemony would take Earth and Mars directly under occupation authority. The Chell Dominion would absorb 4 of our outer colony stations. The Verk Union and the Surai Collective would split the remaining 10 between them. Humans themselves, all 900 million of us, would be processed through the dispersal program, relocated, spread across labor colonies on 40 different worlds, never more than a few million in one place. Never enough in one place to organize, never enough to remember what we had been. The word they used for it was resettlement. I have never hated a word more in my life. Across the chamber, the delegates from 46 other species sat and watched. Some looked at us. Most did not. There was no protest, no raised hand. No one stood and said this was wrong. They simply watched. Karathsal read the decree the way you watch a door close in a building you are leaving. The gavel came down again. Second click, it was official. I looked at the 3 other humans beside me. Nav, our legal attaché, had his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the floor. Petra, our communications officer, was staring straight ahead, jaw tight, not blinking. Old Colonel Harvey, 71 years old and the closest thing to a military representative we had left, sat with his arms crossed, breathing slowly through his nose. None of us spoke. What would we have said? I looked around the chamber one more time. I did something in that moment that surprised even me. I started memorizing faces. Not human faces, alien ones. I studied every delegate in that room. The way the Threnali shifted their wing feathers when they were uncomfortable. The way the Chell delegates leaned their wide, flat bodies slightly forward, which their species does when they feel superior. The way the Verk representative had not looked at us even once during the entire reading. I memorized all of it. I did not know why at the time. I know now. As the chamber began to empty, a Threnali observer approached me. The Threnali are ancient. Their recorded history stretches back over 100,000 years. They hold a permanent non-voting seat on the council. They observe. They document. They almost never speak in session, and they almost never approach anyone informally. This one did. She was small, even for a Threnali. white-feathered, with dark rings around her eyes that I had learned meant advanced age in their species. She moved through the thinning crowd without anyone noticing her, which was a skill in itself, and she stopped beside me at the edge of the gallery. She did not look at me when she spoke. She looked out at the chamber floor. "You are the one called Kale Marin," she said. Her English was precise. Threnali learn languages the way most species breathe, without effort and without accent. "Yes," I said. She pressed something into my hand, a data chip, flat, small, no markings. "They have forgotten what it means to be afraid," she said. Then she walked away. I stood there holding the chip, watching her disappear into the crowd of alien bodies filing out through the tall corridor doors. I did not open it in the chamber. I did not open it on the transport back to the Perseverance, humanity's last active diplomatic vessel, a mid-sized ship running on a crew of 31. I walked to my bunk, sat on the edge of it, and turned the chip over in my fingers for a long time. The ship was quiet, the kind of quiet that fills a place when everyone on board is trying not to say out loud what they are all thinking. I could hear the ventilation system. I could hear Petra crying 2 cabins down, trying to keep it soft. I could hear Harvey, 1 cabin over, not sleeping at all, just sitting in the dark the way old soldiers do when the news is bad. I thought about Earth. I had not been home in 3 years. I thought about my sister Claire, who lived in a coastal town in Cornwall and had 2 children and a husband named Oliver. I thought about whether the dispersal program would keep families together. The decree had not mentioned families. It had not mentioned anything human at all, really. It had spoken of populations and labor capacity and resource distribution. Clinical words, words that turn people into numbers. I thought about the Threnali observer. I thought about what she had said. They have forgotten what it means to be afraid. Not "you should be afraid," not "I am sorry." She had said they, meaning the council, meaning Karath Sal and his directorate, meaning everyone who had just erased humanity from the map of sovereign species without a single dissenting vote. I turned the chip over one more time. Then I picked up my reader, inserted the chip, and looked at what was on it. It was not a message. It was not a speech or a farewell or a record of what had been done to us. It was data, dense, layered, organized with the kind of precision that speaks of years of preparation. Star maps marked with security gaps in council patrol routes. Session schedules for the directorate going forward 18 months. Financial network diagrams showing how the 4 occupying powers were already dividing contracts for human labor. And one encrypted file, sealed under a lock I did not have the key for yet. The file was labeled Agon Protocol. I read everything else first. I read until the light in my cabin had not changed. There is no day cycle on a ship in deep space, but my internal clock told me it had been 6 hours. My eyes burned. I set the reader down. I did not feel despair. I had felt it in the chamber for a few minutes when the gavel came down, but that had passed. What replaced it was quieter and, I think, more dangerous. I felt focused. I pulled up a blank document on my reader. At the top, I wrote 3 names: Nav, Petra, Harvey. I thought about adding more, but 3 was right for now. 3 people on a ship of 31 who I trusted completely, and who were, by any measure, exactly the kind of people you would want beside you when you were about to do something that had never been done before. I wrote one line underneath the names. They made a mistake today. They scattered us. They should have kept us together. I saved the document. I put the reader down, and for the first time in 3 years, I slept deeply and without dreams. The Galactic Council had just ended humanity. They had no idea what they had started. The first morning on Durath Roman 4, the dust got into everything. It was not like Earth dust. Earth dust is light brown or gray, the kind that settles on shelves and windows and wipes off with a cloth. Durath Roman 4 dust was dense and dark red, and it had a fine electrical charge that made it cling to skin, to teeth, to the inside of your nose. You breathed it in and tasted copper for hours. After the first week, you stopped noticing. After the first month, you could not remember what clean air felt like. I had been on the planet for 6 days when a man named Cole Barker found me. Cole was 38. He had been a structural engineer on the colony station Kepler 7 before the dispersal. He was short and broad-shouldered, with calloused hands and the kind of steady eyes that engineers get from spending years working with things that can fall apart if you are not paying attention. He found me in the processing queue at the eastern mine entrance on Durath Roman 4, where 40,000 humans were waiting to be assigned their work sectors for the day. He said nothing at first. He just stood beside me in the line and looked straight ahead. Then, quietly, without turning his head, he said, "You are Cale Marin." I said yes. He said, "I saw your name on the dispersal manifest before they scrambled the files. You were listed as a Class 4 diplomatic detainee. They put you here specifically. That means someone on the council wanted you buried." I had already figured that out. I told him so. He nodded once. "Good. Then we can skip the part where I explain your situation to you and go straight to what I want to show you." That evening, after the first shift, Cole took me to a section of the south dormitory block that the Vokai guards almost never checked, because the ventilation pipes there leaked a foul-smelling mineral vapor that the guards found unpleasant. Humans found it unpleasant too, but unpleasant and dangerous are two different things, and we had already learned to tell the difference. In that corner of the dormitory, behind a false panel that Cole had built himself over the previous 4 months, was a transmitter. It was small, pieced together from components that had come in separately through the supply deliveries, a resistor from a broken mining tool, a signal relay from a decommissioned worker drone, copper wire pulled from a cracked wall conduit. It should not have worked. It worked. "How far does it reach?" I asked. "Colony range," Cole said. "About 40 light seconds, not enough to reach any council station, but enough to reach 4 other human labor colonies in this system." I looked at the transmitter for a long time. "How many people know about this?" 8, all of them here, all of them reliable." "Have you been transmitting?" "Short bursts only, coordinates and status, nothing that looks like language to a standard scan. The Vokai call it static noise." A corner of his mouth moved slightly. "They are not wrong. It is noise. It just happens to be noise that means something." I sat down on the floor in that cramped, foul-smelling corner and thought. The dispersal had been designed to prevent exactly this: humans organizing, humans communicating, humans doing anything except working and staying separated and diminishing slowly until we were no longer a people, just a scattered population of laborers who happened to share a biology. The Vokai High Command had studied history. They knew what happened when conquered peoples were allowed to cluster. They had been thorough. They had also underestimated how comfortable humans are with difficult conditions. I reached into the inside pocket of my work jacket and found the data chip. I had carried it with me every day since the Perseverance. I had memorized the contents before leaving the ship, but I carried it anyway. It helped me think. "I need to contact 3 specific people," I said. "They are in different colonies. I do not know which ones yet. I need to find them without triggering a pattern flag on the Vokai monitoring system." Cole looked at the chip in my hand. He did not ask what was on it. "How long do we have to find them?" "As long as it takes, but less time than the council thinks we have." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me the names." The 3 people I needed were Nav, Petra, and Harvey. Nav had been sent to a chemical processing colony in the inner belt. Petra, I had heard, had been placed on a resource survey team somewhere in the outer reach. Harvey's destination I did not know at all, and that worried me. The colonel was 71, and the Vokai labor classification system did not make allowances for age. Over the next 3 weeks, Cole and his 8-person network began a quiet search through the static noise transmissions bouncing between human colonies in the system. It was slow. It required patience of a kind that I think only people in desperate situations fully understand. The patience that comes not from comfort but from necessity, from knowing that moving too fast is the only mistake you cannot afford. While we waited, I worked. Not because I had to, but because working gave me cover, kept me visible and unremarkable in the colony's daily routine, and because the mine itself was, in a strange way, useful. You learn things in a mine. You learn the layout of a place. You learn where the guards rotate and when. You learn which foremen count carefully and which ones stop counting at 100. You learn that the ventilation shaft in Section 9 connects to the equipment storage bay, where incoming supply deliveries are processed before distribution. You learn, in other words, how things actually work, as opposed to how the people running them think they work. On the 22nd day, Cole found Nav. He was on a chemical processing colony called Yaret Station, 4 light seconds away. His transit job involved moving filtered waste material between processing stages, which meant he had regular, unsupervised access to the waste conduit maintenance corridors. When we reached him through the transmitter, he sent back 3 words in the noise pattern we had established. I have resources. Nav was the kind of person who found resources everywhere. It was why I had included him in my plans on the Perseverance. He had grown up in difficult circumstances and had a natural understanding of how things flow, money, information, favors, and how to redirect that flow without anyone noticing. On Yaret Station, in less than 3 weeks, he had already made himself useful to 2 separate black market operations among the human workers there. He had not done it for personal gain. He had done it because both operations had things he needed. 2 days after we found Nav, Petra made contact with us first. She had found the static noise network on her own. She was Petra. I was not surprised. She was on an outer survey platform called Reach 9, a cold, remote installation where small teams of human workers operated geological sensors for a Volcae mining corporation. The isolation that made Reach 9 miserable had also, she informed us with characteristic efficiency, made it the site of the least monitored human habitation in the system. Harvey we found on the 41st day. He was alive. That was the first thing Cole told me, and something about the way he said it told me he had not been certain that would be the case. Harvey was on a heavy labor colony on the surface of a moon called Duras Minor, doing work that was physically brutal for a man of any age. But Harvey was Harvey. He was 71 years old, and he had spent 50 of those years in situations that would have ended other people. And he had come out of all of them with that same slow, even breathing and crossed arms. When we reached him through the network, he sent back 1 transmission. About time, what is the plan? I smiled for the first time in 41 days. That night in the corner behind Cole's false panel, I pulled out a new blank document and began to write. Not 3 names this time. A structure, a timeline, a set of tasks assigned to 4 people across 3 locations, all connected by a system the Volcae had dismissed as static noise. The Agon protocol file was still locked. I had been working on the encryption when I could. I was close, but I did not need it yet. What I was building now was the foundation beneath the protocol, the human infrastructure that the protocol would run on. The 4 powers occupying human space had divided us, believing that separation would dissolve us. They had not considered the possibility that separation, for humans, is sometimes exactly the environment in which we learn to build things no one else can see. The Volcae had given us 40 worlds. We were already connecting them. It was on the 63rd day that the event happened which changed everything. A man named Henry Cole, no relation to Cole Barker, organized a work slowdown in Sector 4 of the mine. He was not subtle about it. He spoke openly to the workers in his section, told them they were being given inadequate rations for the amount of physical output being demanded, and suggested that working at a sustainable pace rather than an exhausted one was simply a matter of self-preservation. 47 workers in Sector 4 spent the morning shift working at roughly 60% of their usual output. The Volkai response was immediate and severe. A guard named in their language, something that translated approximately to Third Enforcement Officer of the Durath Primary Installation, brought Henry Cole to the central processing yard in front of the entire colony population at midday and made an example of him. I will not describe what they did. I will say only that it was intended to produce fear, and that for perhaps 10 minutes, standing in that yard with 40,000 people around me, it did exactly that. And then something shifted. I felt it before I could explain it, a change in the quality of the silence in that yard. I looked around at faces, at postures, at the way people were standing. The fear was still there, but underneath it something else had arrived, something older and harder. I have thought about that moment many times since. I think what happened is this: grief and anger in humans are not sequential emotions. They do not come one after the other. They arrive together, compressed, and when something forces them to the surface all at once, the result is not despair. The result is a quiet, cold, total commitment. 40,000 people walked back to their stations that afternoon. They worked the rest of the shift without incident. They were perfectly, absolutely cooperative. And that night, the message that went out through the static noise network from Durath Roman 4 to 4 other colonies was the longest transmission Cole's system had ever carried. Every foreman, every supply route, every guard rotation, every structural vulnerability in the mine support systems, every access point to every communication relay in the installation. We sent it all, because Henry Cole had given us something that no council decree and no dispersal program could manufacture. The moment when 40,000 people stopped hopping, someone would save them, and decided, quietly and completely, that they were going to handle it themselves. And on the 68th day, I cracked the encryption on the Agon protocol file. I read it in the dark, in the foul-smelling corner, while Cole watched the corridor. It was not what I had expected. It was not a military plan. It was not a weapons schematic or a rescue operation or anything that required ships or soldiers or any of the things humanity no longer had. It was a political map. A map of every fracture line inside the Galactic Council, every old grudge between species, every disputed territory, every secret the 4 occupying powers were keeping from each other, every senator on the council who had voted for the termination decree not out of agreement, but out of fear of the Volkai hegemony and its fleet. The Threnali had been watching the council for 100,000 years. They had been patient in the way that only very old species can be patient. And they had built, over decades, a document that was essentially a complete guide to how the Galactic Council could be broken apart from the inside. They had given it to me. I sat with that for a long time. Then I wrote Nav, Petra, and Harvey a single message. I know how we win. It is not fast, it will not be comfortable, but it is possible. Are you in? All 3 responded within the hour. Nav sent one word, obviously. Petra sent a list of resources she had already begun gathering on Reach 9 that she had not mentioned yet, because she had not known what they were for. Harvey sent 3 words, what do you need? I started writing. 4 years is a long time to be patient when every day costs something. I will not pretend it was clean or easy, or that I moved through those 4 years with steady confidence. There were months where the plan felt impossible, where the distances between colonies felt too great, where the slow pace of change felt like no change at all. There were nights on Durath Roman 4 when I lay awake in my bunk and ran the numbers again: human population in labor colonies, resource depletion rates, Volkai enforcement capacity, and the numbers were not always encouraging. But numbers are not the whole story. They never are. By the end of the second year, something had happened that I had hoped for but not counted on. Humans had made themselves useful, not in the broken, diminished way the dispersal program had intended. I mean genuinely, structurally useful, in the way that water is useful when it finds the lowest path through rock, not because anyone planned it but because it is the nature of water. Human workers on 40 worlds had, over 24 months, quietly become the operational backbone of installations they did not own. We learned every system we were assigned to. We learned it fully, carefully, and completely, always knowing more than our assigned role required us to know. A human assigned to maintain ventilation in a HFY processing facility would, within 6 months, understand the entire facility's power grid, its communication relays, its emergency protocols, and the personal schedules of its 3 senior administrators. We did not advertise this. We simply did it because we are, at the core, a species that cannot encounter a system without wanting to understand it entirely. This made us very useful, and things that are very useful are, paradoxically, very difficult to discard. My own position had changed significantly by the middle of the 3rd year. Through a combination of demonstrated competence, careful relationship building with the colony's mid-level HFY administrators, and Nav's quiet financial maneuvering, which I will not detail here except to say, it involved 3 separate black market channels and a convincing accounting irregularity that made the colony's efficiency numbers look better than they were. I had been promoted to Colony Administrator, Class 2. It was not a grand title. It meant I managed the daily work assignments for the human population of Durath Roman 4, coordinated supply requests, and reported productivity figures to the HFY district office. It gave me a private office, a communication terminal, and most importantly, a small but real degree of freedom of movement. Freedom of movement, even a small amount, is extraordinary when you have not had it at all. I used the terminal carefully. The HFY monitored all communication from human administrators, but they monitored it the way they monitored everything, by algorithm, scanning for flagged words and patterns. They were good at flagging obvious things. They were less good at recognizing when a series of completely ordinary administrative messages, sent over a period of weeks to different recipients across the system, assembled into a coherent set of instructions when read in the right sequence. Nav had designed the encoding system. It was elegant in a way that made me appreciate him deeply every time I used it. By the start of the 4th year, I had made contact with 34 human-occupied installations across 4 star systems. Not every contact was reliable. Not every network node was secure. But the structure held, and it grew, and by mid-year we had something that the HFY had specifically and deliberately tried to prevent humans from ever having again. We had a coordinated population. Not an army, not a movement with flags and speeches. Just 40 different groups of people on 40 different worlds, all quietly aware of each other, all holding small pieces of a larger plan, all doing their ordinary jobs while understanding that their ordinary jobs were, collectively, something else entirely. During this same period, the Agon protocol began to pay its first dividends. The Threnali's map of the Council's fracture lines was accurate. It was accurate in the way that only very old, very careful observation can produce. The kind of accuracy that does not come from guessing, but from watching the same patterns repeat across centuries. The key fracture was between the HFY hegemony and the Chell dominion. They had voted together to impose the termination decree on humanity. They had divided our space cooperatively. But they had a history that stretched back 800 years. A history of competing territorial claims in the mid-galactic band, 2 wars in the last 3 centuries, and a peace treaty that both sides had observed while quietly preparing to violate. The Threnali's file contained the specifics, border sensor logs that the Chell had falsified, a HFY military buildup near the contested Dersh corridor that had been classified above Council oversight level, a trade agreement signed in secret between the Verk Union and the Chell Dominion that explicitly excluded Volkai commercial interests. None of this information needed to be fabricated. It was all real. It simply needed to reach the right people in the right sequence. Shaped carefully so that each piece arrived looking like it had been discovered independently. Nav handled the Verk-Chell trade agreement. He had contacts by then in 3 different species black market networks, and routing a document through those channels was well within his abilities. Petra handled the Volkai border build-up data. From Reach 9, she had spent 2 years building relationships with independent survey pilots, a scattered, self-employed, politically unaligned group who moved between systems regularly and were, by professional habit, uninterested in being tracked. They were ideal couriers. Harvey, Honduras Minor, handled something different and harder. He reached out to the soldiers. Not Volkai soldiers, the veterans of humanity's 12-year war. Men and women in their 30s and 40s and 50s now, scattered across the labor colonies, carrying the specific grief of people who had fought and lost. Harvey did not organize them. He simply found them and spoke to them, individually, one at a time, in the way that only a 75-year-old colonel who has shared that grief personally can. He told them the same thing each time. Not yet, but hold on. And they did. The most delicate piece of the Agon Protocol involved the Council itself. Specifically, 3 senators representing minor species, the Morin Collective, the Talith Union, and a small aquatic civilization called the Velven, who had voted for the termination decree not because they wanted to, but because the political cost of dissent had been too high at the time. I found them through the Council's open session records, reading between the formal language for the signs that the Threnali's document had taught me to look for. A vote that comes a half-second later than the others. A formal statement of support that uses slightly different phrasing from the agreed consensus language. Small things. But I was, by that point, very good at reading small things. I reached out to the Morin senator first, through a channel so indirect it took 3 months to establish. Her name was something in her language that humans translated as Counselor Veth. She was elderly by her species standards, and she had been on the council for 40 years, and she was deeply tired of the direction it had taken. Our first exchange was careful, formal. I made no requests. I simply shared information, accurate, sourced, documented information about the state of the human labor colonies, the mortality figures, the demographic projections that showed the dispersal program was proceeding faster than the Council's public estimates suggested, meaning the human population in colonies was decreasing at a rate that, in 40 years, would see humanity reduced to a small fraction of its current number. Counselor Veth read the figures. She did not respond for 11 days. Then she sent one line. "What do you need from me?" We were, by that point, exactly where I had wanted to be. The Council's next emergency session was scheduled in 8 months. The trigger for that session was a dispute between the Volkai and Chell over border sensor data. A dispute that had emerged, as if spontaneously, from information that Nav had routed through 3 separate channels over the previous 4 months. I had 8 months to position everything. I had 8 months to make sure that when I walked into that chamber again, I was not walking in as a defeated human diplomat with nothing left to lose. I was walking in as the person who had spent 4 years quietly turning the Council's greatest strategic mistake against itself. They had scattered humanity across 40 worlds. They had put us inside every system they owned. They had made us useful and then forgotten we were there. A child named Lena grew up in the colony school on Durath Roman 4 during those 4 years. She was 7 when I arrived and 11 when I left. She used to sit outside the school in the evenings and draw pictures in the red dust with a stick. She drew things she had never seen: green fields, blue water, the curve of a coastline. She had never been to Earth. She was born in a colony station before the dispersal, Earth was a word her parents used, a story. I watched her draw one of those evenings in the 7th month before the council session, and I understood in a way that I had known intellectually for years but felt fully for the first time, why none of this was optional. Not the risk, not the patience, not any of it. The plan was not about justice, though it was just. It was not about revenge, though that feeling had lived in me for years. It was about Lena drawing coastlines in red dust on a world that was not hers, on a world that had been handed to her like a verdict, and the simple, uncomplicated fact that she deserved better. That was the month I received confirmation of my appointment as a non-voting human observer for the upcoming council emergency session. The first human allowed in that chamber since the day of the sentence. I spent the night before my departure from Durath Roman 4 sitting outside the dormitory, looking at the stars. Nav had sent a message confirming his preparations were complete. Petra had confirmed the survey pilots were in position. Harvey had sent 3 words, as he usually did. "We are ready." I looked up at the stars for a long time. Then I picked up my bag, with the data chip still in the inner pocket, and walked to the transport. I had memorized those faces in the chamber 4 years ago. I had memorized every expression, every posture, every small sign of what each delegate felt and feared. It was time to use what I had learned. The chamber had not changed. The curved perches for the Threnali, the pressure pools for the Velhari, the wide platforms for the Chell, and my one small, flat seat at the back of the gallery, non-voting observer, human delegation, single representative. 14 seats, 1 filled. I sat in the center of them on purpose. I arrived early, which surprised the session coordinator, a small gray-skinned clerk who checked my credentials 3 times as if expecting to find an error. There was none. Counselor Veth of the Morin Collective had submitted the observer request through legitimate channels 6 months prior, and the directorate had approved it without examining it closely. Why would they examine it closely? It was one human, a formality. I sat and watched the chamber fill. The Volkai delegation arrived last, as they always did, a dominance posture their species has practiced for centuries. Karath Zal was still the supreme delegate. Same flat reflective eyes, same unhurried movement. He took his place at the central podium and scanned the room with the expression of a species that has never, in recent memory, been surprised by anything. He did not look at me. The session was called to order. The official agenda was the border dispute between the Volkai hegemony and the Chell dominion. Specifically, allegations that Volkai sensor arrays in the Dersh corridor had been repositioned in violation of the post-war territorial agreements. Karath Zal opened by dismissing the allegations as procedural noise and calling for a standing committee review, which would delay any action by 6 to 8 months and almost certainly bury the matter entirely. It was a maneuver the Threnali's protocol documents described as standard Volkai council practice. Use process as a shield. Delay everything until the opposition loses interest or resources. The Chell delegate, a wide, pale-bodied administrator named Coordinator Thraxis, rose immediately to object. The objection was sharp. Thraxis had documentation, sensor logs, dated and sourced. The logs showed exactly what Nav had ensured they would show. Volkai array positions inconsistent with treaty boundaries, captured in a survey data package that appeared to have been discovered independently by a Chell monitoring station. The Volkai legal team produced counter-documentation within 4 minutes. They had been expecting this. What they had not been expecting was what Thraxis produced in response to the counter-documentation. A second set of logs from a different date, from a different independent source, consistent with the first set. The second set had come from Petra's survey pilots. The chamber's noise level rose. Not shouting. The translation system makes true shouting impossible, flattening it into a steady murmur. but a sustained, agitated hum that 47 species worth of delegates produced when simultaneously surprised and alarmed. Kareth Saul called for order. He got it, he was good at that. Then the Morin counselor Veth stood. Beside her, the Talith and Velvan representatives stood at the same moment, all three, simultaneously. It takes preparation to stand at exactly the same moment. They had prepared. Counselor Veth addressed the chamber. She did not address the border dispute. She moved, under emergency procedural rules, to enter a supplementary matter of humanitarian oversight into the session record. The rules allowed this. They were old rules, written in the Council's founding charter and almost never used, which is why the Directorate's legal team required 45 seconds to locate the relevant provision and confirm that it was, in fact, valid. Those 45 seconds were the longest 45 seconds of my life. Then Veth's motion was confirmed as procedurally valid, and she began to speak. She presented the mortality figures from the human labor colonies. She presented them simply, without commentary, reading the numbers in the measured, precise way of her species, which has a tradition of letting facts make their own arguments. Births, deaths, population decline rates, projected figures at 10 years, 20 years, 40 years. The chamber was very quiet. She then yielded the floor to me. I had not been announced as a speaker. I was a non-voting observer. Non-voting observers do not have speaking rights in session. The Directorate's legal team began to raise this point, and then Counselor Veth produced, from her documentation package, a second motion, co-signed by herself, the Talith, and the Velvan, granting the human observer provisional speaking status for this session under emergency humanitarian procedures. It was also a valid motion. Harvey, who had spent 3 months reviewing the Council's founding charter through a contraband document feed that Nav had arranged, had found the provision. The legal team confirmed it, provisionally valid. Kareth Saul looked at me for the first time since I had entered the chamber. I stood up. I did not bring notes. I had read everything on that chip so many times over 4 years that the information lived in me now, the way a language does when you have spoken it long enough. I began with the history, not humanity's history, the Council's. I began with the vote on the termination decree 4 years prior, and I named every delegate who had voted for it. Then I named every delegate who had voted for it under documented pressure from the Volkai hegemony. Because the Threnali's files contain the meeting records, the communications, the specific instances in which Volkai diplomatic representatives had made clear to smaller species what the cost of a dissenting vote would be. I did not say the word coercion. I did not need to. The chamber said it for me in 47 murmured translations. Then I presented the Agon Protocol's core findings. Not all of them. I had selected carefully. I presented the Volkai military buildup in the Dersh corridor, with the classified documentation that should never have been classified above Council oversight level. I presented the secret trade agreement between the Verk Union and the Chell Dominion. I presented the suppressed Volkai bioship vulnerability data that the hegemony's own scientists had buried to prevent internal panic. I presented each piece the same way Veth had presented the mortality figures, simply, without commentary, one fact at a time. The chamber noise rose and did not come back down. I looked at Kareth Saul while I spoke. I had promised myself I would do that. I would look at him directly, the way he had looked at the decree 4 years ago, reading it without blinking while humanity sat in the back row and held very still. I wanted him to know that I had memorized his face that day, and that I had spent 4 years learning what to do with what I remembered. He did not flinch. He was Volkai. They do not flinch. But his flat, reflective eyes moved, for the first time, with something that I recognized. He was calculating, not with the calm of certainty, but with the sharp, rapid internal movement of someone who has suddenly discovered that the ground is not where they thought it was. That was enough for me. That was what the Threnali observer had described in her 8 words. They had forgotten what it means to be afraid. They were remembering now. When I finished, I sat down. Councillor Veth immediately filed the motion of no confidence in the current directorate, the first such motion in 400 years. The Taelith co-signed. The Velven co-signed. Then 3 more signatures came from delegates I had not expected, species I had not directly contacted. They had simply been in the room, listening, and they had made their own decisions. Karath Sal ordered my detention. He said it in the controlled, authoritative tone that had closed the termination decree 4 years ago. The Threnali observer, the same one who had pressed the chip into my hand in this very building, stood from her non-voting seat and spoke for the first time in a council session that I was aware of. She stated, in her precise English that the translator rendered across 47 channels, that detaining a provisional speaker during an active motion would constitute a procedural violation with consequences under the founding charter. Another delegate stood, then another, then 3 more, not all in agreement with me, some standing to protest, some standing to support. The chamber was no longer a room of 47 aligned species performing a foregone conclusion. It was 47 species responding, genuinely and separately, to something real. The security officers at the chamber doors looked at Karath Sal. They looked at the chamber. They looked at each other. They did not move. The motion passed. 28 votes to 19. The directorate was suspended pending a formal review. Karath Sal's authority to issue binding orders was frozen under the Charter's procedural suspension clause. It was not a defeat of the Volkai hegemony. It was not the restoration of human sovereignty. It was not the end of anything we had suffered. But it was the first thing we had won in 4 years. And then the news came through Nav's network, relayed from a hegemony military frequency that Petra's survey pilots had been quietly monitoring for 6 months. The Volkai fleet was moving. Karath Sal had given the order from the chamber floor, in the same breath as the detention command, and the fleet had been close enough that it was already in motion before the vote concluded. They were coming to the council station, not to negotiate, to restore order in the Volkai definition of the phrase. The chamber fell silent in a different way this time, a functional silence, people understanding all at once what was about to happen. I looked at the ceiling of the Grand Conclave chamber. I breathed once slowly. Then I reached into my jacket pocket, took out a small communication unit that Cole Barker had built for me before I left Durath Roman 4, and sent a single encoded signal. 1 word. Now, I want to tell you what happened clearly, because I think clarity matters more than drama when the thing you are describing is real. The Volkai fleet, 42 warships, moved toward Council Station Vailthon with the full weight of the hegemony's military authority behind it. The fleet carried enough firepower to suppress any conventional resistance the station could offer. The Volkai knew this. That was the point. What they had not accounted for was the signal I sent. Now traveled from my communication unit through a relay network that Nav, Petra, Harvey, and I had spent 4 years quietly building inside every major Volkai supply and support installation in range. It arrived at 38 different human-operated facilities within minutes. It did not ask anyone to pick up a weapon. It asked them to do something much simpler. To stop. At 400 station time, every major Volkai starship fueling depot in the region went into maintenance lockdown. The humans operating the depot systems, who had, over 4 years, become the people who actually understood how those systems worked, initiated emergency safety protocols that were, technically, perfectly legitimate procedures. Overheating readings in storage cells. Pressure irregularities in transfer conduits. Routine safety checks that, according to protocol, required the facilities to suspend all external transfer operations until cleared. The HFY fleet had left port fast, operating on an emergency mobilization order. They had left fast enough that their fuel reserves were calculated for a direct transit to the station and back, with combat margin, not for an extended hold while depots were offline. 31 of the 42 ships had to reduce speed and reroute to secondary fueling points. Those points were operated by a mix of species, but the technical maintenance staff at 2 of them, the ones the fleet needed most urgently, were human. Those staff initiated their own safety protocols within 40 minutes of my signal. The fleet was not stopped, but it was slowed. It was slowed by 4 hours and 20 minutes. That was enough. During those 4 hours, the council station was not idle. Councillor Veth, the Talith delegate, and the Velvan representative convened an emergency session of the 7 non-HFY permanent council members who were present on the station. I was not in that session. I do not have the formal account of what was said. What I know is what happened as a result. The Verk Union sent a formal communiqué to the HFY hegemony. It was not a declaration of opposition. It was a question, politely worded, precisely targeted. It asked for clarification of the hegemony's military intentions toward the council station, in light of the Charter's provisions against military coercion of council proceedings. The Chell Dominion sent its own communiqué, less polite, more direct. The Chell had by that morning received the full documentation of the secret Verk-Chell trade agreement that I had been careful not to reveal in the chamber session. I had delivered it separately to the Chell delegate 2 hours before the session began. The Chell were not happy about it. But they were significantly less happy about the HFY fleet moving toward a station where, if hostilities began, Chell commercial interests represented a multi-trillion credit exposure. The Verk Union and Chell Dominion had spent 8 centuries as quiet enemies. On that day, they sent communiques to the HFY hegemony within 11 minutes of each other, asking the same question about military intentions. The hegemony's fleet command, operating on an emergency order from a directorate that had just been suspended pending review, slowed further. Then Petra released the bioship vulnerability data. She had held it as long as we had agreed, until the fleet was committed enough that revering course would be politically costly, but delayed enough that the alternative to reversal was worse. The data went to the 3 dissident senators, who distributed it across 3 separate Secure Council channels simultaneously. It was not a dramatic leak. It arrived as an addendum to the ongoing emergency session documentation, clearly sourced, clearly authenticated. The HFY bioship vulnerability was not existential. It was not a weakness that would destroy their fleet overnight. But it was real. It was classified at the highest levels for a reason, and its sudden appearance in council documentation meant that every species on that station now knew something that the HFY had spent decades and significant resources to suppress. The hegemony fleet came to a full stop 40 minutes before it would have reached effective weapons range of the station. In the communication that followed, conducted through official council channels that now, technically, fell under the authority of the suspended directorate's review board rather than Karath Sal directly, the hegemony's position had changed. Not its values, not its ambitions, but its position. The ground had shifted under it in too many directions at once. The fleet held. Negotiations were proposed. The hegemony accepted the proposal. They accepted it in the controlled, authoritative language of a species that was being very careful not to acknowledge that they had accepted it because the alternative had become unclear. I was in a small observation room off the main corridor when Nav's voice came through my communication unit. He was still on Yaret Station. I had not seen him in 4 years. He said they stopped. I said yes. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Now what?" That was the question. It was always going to be the question. The vote, the fuel depots, the fleet holding position, none of it was the answer. It was all scaffolding. The actual structure that needed to be built was still ahead of us. "Now we go to work," I said. The formal negotiations took 11 weeks. I will not walk through all of them. They were grinding, technical, exhausting work. The kind that people who write about great historical moments tend to leave out, because the detail of it resists drama, and the truth of it is that most of what decides things is not the dramatic moment, but the 11 weeks of argument and documentation and compromise that follows it. Counselor Veth led the council side of the talks. I was her informal advisor, which was the most official role a human could hold given that we were still, technically, in terminated status. Harvey joined us on the station in the third week, brought in from Duras Minor on a medical transport. His health had not been strong after the heavy labor, and I was furious about that. In a way, I kept very controlled during the sessions, because controlled fury is more useful than expressed fury when you are sitting across a table from the people responsible for it. Nav arrived in the 5th week. I had not prepared myself adequately for how he looked. Thinner, older. The work on Yaret Station had taken things from him that rest and food would not immediately return, but his mind was entirely intact. He sat down beside me in the negotiation room, and within an hour had identified 3 procedural angles in the proposed transition framework that the Voakai legal team had buried in technical language, hoping they would pass unexamined. They did not pass unexamined. Petra remained on Reach 9 through most of the negotiations. She was coordinating the network, maintaining the 38 connection points across the system, keeping the human colony communications active, making sure the thing we had built over 4 years did not quietly collapse now that the immediate crisis had passed. It was unglamorous work. She is the person I will be most grateful to for the rest of my life. The Charter of Restored Sovereignty was a document that required 14 drafts before everyone in the room would sign it. It was not what we wanted. It was what was achievable. It granted humanity provisional autonomous status, not full sovereignty, not council membership, but a recognized standing that ended the terminated classification and halted the dispersal program. It established a human oversight council with observer rights in the Galactic Council. It committed the 4 occupying powers to a timetable for releasing human colony stations back to human administration. Earth and Mars remained under a transitional arrangement that I will not call occupation, because the legal language was carefully crafted to avoid that word, but which functioned similarly for the near term. The timetable for full withdrawal was 20 years. I negotiated it down from 40. Harvey, across the table from the Voakai legal team, negotiated it down from 20 to 15. I do not know exactly what he said in the private session that produced that result. I know it involved his tone of voice, which, when Harvey chose to use it, had a quality that even alien species appeared to find persuasive. 15 years. Not immediate, not what any of us wanted, but a number with an end. On the day the charter was signed, I stepped out of the negotiation room and walked to the observation deck of the council station. It was the same station where the termination decree had been read. The same station where the Threnali observer had pressed a chip into my hand. I stood at the viewport and looked out at the stars. Earth was not visible from here, wrong angle, wrong distance, but I knew the direction and I looked toward it anyway. I thought about Lena, drawing coastlines in red dust on Durath Roman 4. She would be 11 years old now. I thought about Cole Barker, whose transmitter had been the first piece of the network. I thought about Henry Cole, who had not lived to see this day, and about the 40,000 people who had walked back to their stations in silence and decided, quietly, to handle it themselves. I thought about Claire, my sister, in Cornwall, and her husband Oliver, and her 2 children, whose names I had not heard in 4 years, and who I hoped were still drawing coastlines of their own, in their minds if nowhere else. The Threnali observer appeared beside me, the same one White feathers, dark rings around her eyes, that same quality of moving through a room without being seen until she chose to be. "It worked," I said. I did not mean it as a question. I meant it as something I was still processing. "It worked," she agreed. We stood in silence for a moment. "Why us?" I said. It was the question I had been carrying for 4 years, ever since she had pressed the chip into my hand and walked away. The Agon protocol, the council maps, the fracture lines, all of it. You built that over decades. You could have used it yourself. You could have given it to any species. Why humans? Why now? She was quiet for long enough that I thought she might not answer. Then she said, "Because we needed a species that would not simply replace the directorate with themselves. Power given to an undamaged species tends to produce another version of the structure it replaced." She paused. "You had been broken enough to understand what the structure costs, but not broken enough to stop. That combination is rarer than you might imagine." I looked out at the stars. "We are not fixed," I said. "Humanity is not fixed. 15 years is a long time, and the timetable may slip, and there are 900 million people who have been living in labor colonies for 4 years who are going to come home changed and difficult and angry, and rebuilding is going to be harder than anything we have done so far." "Yes," she said. "And I am one person. We did not do this because I was exceptional. We did this because 40,000 people in a mining yard decided they were not going to accept being erased, and because 4 people with a transmitter made of salvaged parts started talking across a system, and because there were 3 alien senators who were tired of being afraid to vote their conscience, and because—" She held up one slender hand. A Threnali gesture I had learned meant something close to "I know." "I know," she said. "That is precisely the point." I turned back to the viewport. Behind us, through the station's corridor, I could hear the sound of the other human representatives who had traveled to the station for the signing. 30 people, the largest group of humans in that building since the termination decree. They were talking, not quietly. They were filling the corridor with the ordinary, carrying, overlapping noise of people who have been told to be small for a long time and have just been given permission, in writing, to take up space again. It was the best sound I had heard in 4 years. I held the data chip one last time. I had been carrying it for so long that I had stopped noticing the weight of it, the way you stop noticing the weight of something you carry every day. Now I noticed it again. Small, flat, no markings. I turned it over in my fingers one last time. Then I put it in my pocket and turned away from the viewport. There was work to do. There was always going to be work to do. The charter was signed, but the real structure, the human infrastructure across 40 worlds, the communication networks, the relationships with dissident senators, the careful understanding of how the council actually functioned, all of that had to be maintained and expanded and used for the next 15 years to make sure the timetable held. Cole Barker was already on his way to the station. He had been appointed, through the new Human Oversight Council, as head of Intercolony Infrastructure Coordination, a title we had invented the previous week because no existing title captured what he actually needed to do. Nav would run the network's financial architecture, because Nav understood money flows the way other people understood gravity, as a natural force that could be redirected but not denied. Petra would remain in communications. Harvey, whether he liked it or not, would rest for at least 2 months before I let him do anything else. And I would go back to being a diplomat, a real one this time, with actual standing and a chair that was not in the back row. I walked back into the corridor. Someone handed me a cup of something hot. I did not know what it was, some alien blend from the station cafeteria. I drank it anyway. Nav was leaning against the corridor wall, talking to a Velvan delegate in what appeared to be a lively and productive conversation about interspecies financial protocols. He caught my eye across the corridor and nodded once. I nodded back. The Galactic Council had convened 4 years and 11 weeks ago, and ended humanity with a soft, dry click. They had gotten a great many things wrong, the most important of which was this: they had looked at us and seen something that could be concluded, a species with a limited capacity for continuance, a civilization that could be terminated like a sentence. What we are, in fact, is a species that takes conclusions as starting points. They thought it was over. It had just begun.